Well, I think the digital divide, if you use the rural areas as an example, which is my area of expertise, it's very clear that we have the opportunity, if we close the digital divide, to take the rural areas, to put them on the same par in terms of economic development, prosperity, and quality of life as urban areas for a whole range of different things. You can start off with education. That's digital divide, the bridge that jumps over that is distance learning, one example. Another example is for businesses. If you close the digital divide in rural areas, what you're doing is taking away what up to this point has been the disadvantage of geographic isolation. And for a business, what that means is they can be their own Amazon. They can sell to anyone in the world, anyone in the US, anyone in California, not just the 5,000 people that might live within 25 miles of where they are. That's going to make a difference in the kind of business prosperity that they have. CETF is very important because it is the focused spokesperson for broadband and the digital divide. The two really are synonymous in terms of dealing with the issue. There's no other entity in the state that is single purpose as that, and it's what's needed. It is something that while, in my job, when I go around and I talk to people about broadband and the importance of it, everyone's kind of recognizes that, but nobody shows up to do anything about it because it's not part of their job. It's not part of their organization, but it's CETF's mandate, and that's really critical to make that point. Well, from my perspective, and mine's particularly focused on rural, but I think it applies throughout the whole state. First of all, I'd set the background, and about 95% of the state geographically is rural. So most people, when they think of California, they think of, oh, California's urban, they think of the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, and in fact, 95% of the population of the state lives in urban areas. But 95% of the state, 96% of the state actually is rural by geography. So if you want to have a ubiquitous broadband system or take care of the digital divide, you've got to look at the rural areas. And my advice would be, if you're only going to do one thing in California for rural areas, for the rural economy and rural quality of life, I would invest in rural broadband infrastructure. Like that 95, 96%, because you think of the state as urban and all the issues are thought of as from an urban context. But in fact, by geography, the state is rural. It's just as rural as you might think of Wyoming. And probably that percentage isn't that much different when you think about it. And think about California, you've got mountains, deserts, the valleys, you have forests, ranches. It's all out there in a huge acreage. And so that's what's actually left out. The state of California needs to invest in broadband infrastructure. And again, if you only did one investment, I was actually asked this at the state legislative hearing last year, and the question was literally this: if you only could invest in one thing to help rural areas, what would you invest in? And my answer was rural broadband infrastructure. And the reason why is it is a platform for all of the different areas, from economic growth, prosperity, better health care, and better health for rural residents, quality of life in rural areas, the whole range of things. They will improve if they've got the broadband. It's a single connector. I would say the analogy is to when they built the Transcontinental Railroad to California. That railroad was a connector to California. People, goods, incredible benefits. And you couldn't really point to what was going to happen. When you knew the railroad was good, but you couldn't identify every single piece that was a benefit. Broadband is the same thing. There's a lot of benefits that we're not going to be able to point to right now, because the future will just take advantage of that. Yes. If you were just to look at agriculture and you were to look at, well, let's look at now, we're in the fifth, I guess approaching a 6th year of drought. And the surface water has been cut off, or water from the aqueducts has been cut off for most of the Central Valley or San Joaquin Valley for farmers. But farm production until last year actually kept going up. And it was driven largely by the fact they shifted to pumping groundwater. They also adopted the most efficient technology for irrigation that they could find. So just to give you an example of what this means is, some of this technology, you could save 40% of the water you otherwise would use for the crop and potentially double the yield. Now think about what that means. Usually when you think about cutting water back, you think that there would be some acceptable decline in yield, and you do the math and it's acceptable and it works out. But this is the case where the technology comes in, and it's more complex than what I'm talking about. But the technology would allow you to use less water and increase yield. That doesn't happen very often in most things. None of that works unless you have wireless broadband in the farm field. You can't adopt that technology. So that's how important things are for farmers, and that specific example as to where they're going.